Hi friends, welcome to CodeNet, and today we want to understand how we can implement CSS inside an HTML document. CSS, if we were to discuss the entire components of CSS, it is a course on its own. Actually, we've even provided a link that will lead you to that course. What do the acronyms stand for? Well, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. Cascading Style Sheet. It's more like you have a skeleton, like we were saying from the introduction. HTML is just a skeleton. Now that skeleton needs flesh. So the actual flesh that's given to the skeleton is what we call CSS. CSS entails the actual behavior, the very actual behavior that the elements of HTML should be following. It is the thing that allows us to see colors, the clear displays, and anything, navigations, and that's what CSS can do. CSS is simply the styling of the actual web page which we are working on. So CSS can be applied in HTML using three ways. The first one is called an inline CSS, the other one is called an internal CSS, then the other one is called an external CSS. That's what we can use if we want to style an HTML document. But in this session, we just talk about two types, which is inline CSS and the internal CSS. The external CSS, we'll see it on the very last of these sessions as we will be understanding the introduction to CSS and PHP. So here we want to see, okay, how can we implement an inline CSS? Let me just provide a comment saying, okay, inline CSS. So inline CSS is the very thing that we've been doing so far. We've been styling each and every element of HTML. For example, if you want to provide actually the actual CSS on an inline element, we just give that element the specific information that it needs for it individually to be styled. For example, we are saying, okay, style, that's the actual keyword, which entails that we are working with an inline CSS, and it is definitely an attribute of HTML, the equal sign, and of course the two inverted commas. And in here, that's where we need to pass now the actual values of CSS that will allow us to style this paragraph, because it is definitely a paragraph. If we were now definitely to say, okay, let's first work on the background color, we can say, okay, background, definitely we say color. So the background color, let's say, okay, the background color to blue. So if we set the background color is blue, then definitely we are done. A semicolon, then we can proceed again styling the same paragraph as an element. We can say, okay, let now the color for the text be white. So definitely we've also specified the color for the text. Again, we can proceed saying, okay, let now the text align, which is where we want to position this text. Let this be at center. So text alignment is now at position which is center. If we don't forget, this is an inline CSS. Inline because it is specified on the very actual element that we want to style. If we were to go on our browser now, you can tell that this is what we were working on. But up to now, it's still, of course, dormant in the same way it is by default. But if we refresh, we'll see the actual impact of an inline CSS on this paragraph. If we refresh, when we do that, the background color is definitely blue and the actual text is in white. So this is what an inline CSS can do. It can style the very actual element that we want to style using the key attribute which is style. But how does now the actual other type of CSS work when it comes to HTML? When we go on the same IDE we are using, which is Visual Studio, definitely we can again implement the second type of CSS, which is called an internal CSS. It is called internal CSS. Now the internal CSS is of course implemented in the elements that are called the head element. As an element of head, that element, since we don't want that to be shown on the browser, because we said the content that are in the body element, they are the things that are shown on the browser. Hence, that element should just be inside the elements of HTML, but not in the elements of the body as an element of HTML. To implement the head element, the head as an element, in definition we just define it as an element that holds on to metadata, data that describes data, if we were to define metadata. Now here we are saying, okay, how do we implement the head element of HTML? Well, an element, as usual, it should have a starting tag and an ending tag. Hence, to implement the head element, we use the keyword head. Now this should be inside the starting tag. So the starting tag is simply that less than sign. Of course, we say head, and definitely we close that. And by default also the IDE will even provide the ending tag, because it also knows that an element should have a starting tag and an element tag. So now we to implement the CSS, the internal CSS, let's even add a comment, because we've understood what comments are from our previous sessions. This is internal CSS. Internal CSS shouldn't be, of course, specified on the very actual element that we want to work on. No. So we use the key element, which is called the style, to denote that here we want to start working with CSS. So the key element, which is style, an element should have a starting tag and an ending tag. Else we create the style as simply the starting tag, and by default the IDE will even provide the closing tag. If you are using Notepad or anything and it's not doing this, please, you can do that manually. It's fine, it can work out. So this is what is done. Here we are saying, okay, I now want to create internal CSS, but internal CSS should be in the head as an element of HTML. The head as an element of HTML should be within the HTML element, and here it is. So this is definitely internal CSS. But what happens if now we want to start styling the entire content that is within the HTML document? We need first to be specifying the actual element that we need to specify, then open and close using the curly braces, and then from there we pass in the properties. What I'm saying is this. For example, if we want the entire body of this HTML element to be of the color, maybe let's say red, then definitely we need first to specify that yes, the styling that I want to be implementing after this should be, of course, having effect on the element called body as an element. Then provide the curly braces, open and close, then you do that. Then from here you can even start specifying the, okay, the background color for this element, which is the body, should be red, and definitely you even do that. And then the color for the text, should be definitely, let's say, blue, though this color combination again, it's something else. And then we can specify saying, okay, text alignment, let's say align, which is the actual text, should be definitely centered, which is the keyword center. So once we do this, then we are saying, okay, we are styling the body as an element inside this HTML document, and the curly braces will hold on to the properties that we want to give effect to the body element. If we are to go back on our browser and we refresh, this is the actual background color and the color by default. Let's refresh. Once we refresh, then you can tell that, yeah, most definitely, though the color combination is poor, but we can tell that this is the actual effect that we've received from the actual implementation of an internal CSS. Let's go back on our browser. Likely, we can even reduce on the colors by using OK. Yeah, we can now go on that type of color by using the same IDE. So since we've already created the syntax for the internal CSS and we've specified the actual style, which is of course the style denoting that we are working with internal CSS, then it means we can style each and any of the elements that we wish to style inside this CSS as an internal CSS. For example, we can say, okay, I want also to put a style on an H2 element, the actual elements that's within this document, and you also open the curly braces and you close, and then we can say, okay, each and every H2 as an element that is inside this document should have the background color, of course, should have the background color. Let's say we say the background color should be black, and the actual color of text that are denoting h2 as an element, the color for the text should definitely be white. So this will definitely be effective. It will be effective because we know and we understand that we are within the internal CSS, and internal CSS can be used to style each and every element down here if we don't want to use the inline CSS. So when we go back on our browser, we'll see that each and every h2 as simply the second heading will be given black as the actual color that it will hold. Clothes, the background color is black. Mathematics, the background color is black. So this is what we can learn so far on the CSS. CSS can be implemented using 3 ways: the inline CSS, internal CSS, and external CSS. But for now, we've just analyzed internal CSS, and this is the very critical one where we say, okay, we need to create an element which is called style inside the head element. A head element adds on to metadata. I'm sure you can also entail that this is for real metadata because we are working on the entire document on the very top head, or inside the head as an element of HTML, and then the head should be within the HTML element. And the other type of CSS is called an inline CSS, where we specify the actual content that should be styled whilst giving it in the very respective starting tag for the actual element that we want this process to be worked on. So guys, let's proceed on our next session as we understand more and more content on HTML. Please don't forget to subscribe, and you are on Coordinate.